The only Zen at the top of a mountain is the Zen you bring there, right?
It's like the Banksy quote. Well, I never took initiative because no one told me to. But you got to admit, man, this guy was really clever because instantly women smoking in public like soared.
Change the story, you change the future.
And we're going to dive into the story that you won with.
A story that's been written in like 27 minutes flat.
I was rewatching a Black Mirror and I just thought to myself, why is there no white mirror? Why is there no good science fiction that presents a more hopeful future for humans?
If we change the stories that we tell ourselves, then we're going to act differently with regards to what we do today and what we do tomorrow. You can learn a lot in hell if you figure out how to bring a little bit of heaven with you.
That sentiment alone just hit me right between the eyes.
Hi, I'm Jim O'Shaughnessy, and welcome to Infinite Loops. Sometimes we get caught up in what feel like infinite loops when trying to figure things out. Markets go up and down, research is presented and then refuted, and we find ourselves right back where we started. The goal of this podcast is to learn how we can reset our thinking on issues that hopefully leaves us with a better understanding as to why we think the way we think and how we might be able to change that to avoid going in infinite loops of thought. We hope to offer our listeners a fresh perspective on a variety of issues and look at them through a multifaceted lens, including history, philosophy, art, science, linguistics, and yes, also through quantitative analysis. And through these discussions, help you not only become a better investor, but also become a more nuanced thinker. With each episode, we hope to bring you along with us as we learn together. Thanks for joining us. Now please enjoy this episode of Infinite Loops.
Jim O'Shaughnessy is Chairman and Co-Chief Investment Officer of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management, where Jamie Catherwood is an associate. All opinions expressed by Jim, Jamie, and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another episode of Infinite Loops. After all, they're infinite, so we will have an infinite number of them, never, ever ending. I am super excited about today's because even though I can see him and even though I know who he is, he has chosen to remain in his nom de plume. What would you say that tinkered thinking is a gestalt? Well, what is it?
It's an art project that's kind of like a brand. It's something to just personally just play around with. And honestly, like my personal identity would be sort of a garish, sort of a blight on it. I think not a blight, it's not needed. Like, you got the title of the book and then you got the author and then you got the author picture. It's like, why don't you just scrap that and just have the title of the book kind of thing? Just keep it simple. Keep it simple, stupid.
And so for my audience, if you missed it, I got pretty tired. Even though I love Black Mirror, I love science fiction.
Oh, me too.
I love Black Mirror. I was rewatching a Black Mirror and I just thought to myself, why is there no white mirror? Why is there no good science fiction that presents a more hopeful future for humans? And I started looking and you know what? There is some, to be fair, there is some, but honestly, it's not nearly as good as the Terminator and as, Blade Runner and all of these dystopias. And so we decided at Infinite Loops to run a contest. And what we asked for was stories based on a more optimistic view of the future. And you, my fine sir, were like, not only did you win the entire competition, you also submitted like 10 submissions, each of which was really fucking good, to be honest. It's like, I'm reading and I like, did I like this one better or did I like this one better? Your protagonist is named Lucilius, who I would have known as the Roman satirist, but you told me in our earlier conversation was actually the name of the fellow that Seneca was addressing his letters to.
Yeah, correct. He was a little sort of a government peon who did some writing. I think he did write some plays. I can't remember too much, but he was just Seneca was always writing to this Lucilius character, and Letters from a Young Poet like Rilke, which I'd read years prior. It was the same sort of setup where you don't get to read any of Lucilius's letters. You just sort of hear about him via what Seneca's saying in response to his letters. So he's sort of this mysterious character in history, and sort of did a quick Google search. I was like, has anyone used this name? This name is fantastic. It's kind of like Lucifer,
Great name.
sort of like a neutral positive version of Lucifer, Lucilius.
Yeah.
And I think Shakespeare uses him as a like a side character in one play. And after that, I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to totally use this. It was
love it.
It was also inspired a bit by like I was reading Taleb at the time, and how Taleb uses the character Nero, which is like a fictionalized version of himself.
Right.
And he like crashes them in a helicopter at one point and stuff. And I loved how that was this sort of really very playful juxtaposition with all of his nonfiction writing. He was just injecting these tiny fictional segments where he was, kind of playing around with this version of himself, that and like Fat Tony. And so when Tinkered Thinking evolved almost by accident, very organically, and I was just writing all of this sort of whimsical nonfiction. I was just, writing for the sake of writing. And there's a backstory to why that was happening. But I was like, all of this is kind of dry if I do this 7 days a week. And I wanted to do it every day. I was like, well, what if I do a short story once a week? And I was like, well, it's kind of a tall order. And I was like, screw it. I'm going to try it. And yeah, a year later, I was like, I have like 50 of these stories. I was like, I should plop this all into a Word document and see how long it is. Yeah. Now there's two published volumes.
Two published volumes. They're beautiful, by the way.
Thank you. I designed them and did everything from scratch for them. The third volume is written. I just haven't put it into book form. And then volume 4 is already half written also. So I want to get to at least 5 volumes and then do like a big sort of best of collection. But yeah, after a year, I was like, I dumped them all into a Word document. I was like, I have a book.
Amazing, right?
I accidentally wrote a book.
I have been known to do that as well. One of the things that I love about your work that I want to get into is you really do have, I'd say, 3 common themes in your Lucilius stories. The first one that is obvious is they're really distributed through time and space, right?
Yes.
And which I find interesting. I'm fascinated by time. I think that what we think of as time is not the way time works. And
I think about time and gravity almost every day, and it's just like a giant question mark. I'm like,
you too, right?
I'm like, what is going on with this time thing? And I've read like a whole bunch of physics in this in terms of, Elegant Universe back in the day.
Same with me. Yep.
It's like, I know the theory of relativity and all that stuff. And it's like, still, it's like this time thing. Like, what is going on here? Like, where's the rewind button? I think, is there one? There might be one. I don't know.
Maybe. Anyway, so we are both fascinated by and flummoxed by the idea of time. You also obviously prefer the short story to long form. Is there a reason for that? Do you think that short stories are more immediate in the effect that they have on I love short stories, by the way. But I also love novels. I wanted to get your view on was it just a preference? Why do you think you chose to stay with the short story as opposed to a novella or even a book?
I mean, I guess this requires a little bit more personal backstory. I mean, back in the day, I was like horribly, almost tragically serious about fiction writing. And I was quite a Luddite. I had a very different view of the future and technology. I was very sort of negative on technology. I used a typewriter. There was a long stint of time I refused to own a cell phone.
Wow.
Like
you committed. You did it.
Yeah, my friends would be like, how do I get in touch with you? I was like, my address, write me a letter. And they're like, what is wrong with you? And I was like, plenty. Deal with it. I was a bit of a hard ass in that way. But I was, like I said, I was horribly serious about it. And I was trying to craft what in my mind was like, serious literature. I would write like 12 hours a day, but I kind of went a little crazy in some sense. Like I would spend 12 hours rewriting a single sentence, and paragraphs took weeks, stories took many months, but by the end they were very polished and very honed. And they were things that I'm still quite proud of when I read. And then I had quite an intellectual shift. It was actually because of Tony Seba, one of his lectures on disruption technology that a good friend sent me. And within 60 minutes, like it was as if someone had crawled into the center of the web that is my mind and just started spinning it like a blender. And then all of these sort of ramifications about what the future could be started to unravel. And I kind of gave up that mission of writing what one might hope to be, quote unquote, literature. And then gave that up and kind of went through a bit of a mourning period. I was like, I got to start getting interested in different things. I started teaching myself how to code, just a radically different shift. But eventually I just missed writing, like the act of writing. It's like, I've given up that dream, or I've changed what I'm thinking about with regards to the future. But I really enjoyed that act of just like sitting down with myself and playing with this tool of language that we have at our disposal. And so I was like, okay, I got like a lot on my plate these days. I'm going to give myself 20 minutes in the morning to write. And I'm going to give myself the additional challenge of no editing. You went crazy on editing. You're just going to spend 20 minutes and it's got to be a cohesive thing, and you push it out the window. And then the next day, fresh sheet, something new. So the challenge is write something new, cohesive, somewhat finished every single day, and then just, shove it into the past kind of thing. And I did that for like 3 months, and I had like 50,000 words worth of these sort of entries. And as I said, I was teaching myself how to code. And one of, the first exercises I built a blog as an exercise with no plan of creating a blog for myself. But when it came to that point where it's like, all right, I need some like placeholder text. And when you're learning how to code, there's ipsum lorem, which is some Latin gibberish that you just put in there. And I was like, oh, well, I have all this writing. I'll just put it in here for fun. And so I did that. And then the sort of idea, the aesthetic idea of a brand sort of started to materialize. I used to be an art teacher and I've done a lot of drawing, painting, and sculpting. So I started like designing different parts of this website just to make it pretty, because I enjoyed that, pretty. And, soon I had tinkered thinking, and I just showed it to a friend who is a bit of a mentor to me with regards to teaching myself how to code, who sort of got me started, gave me the first like 30-minute tutorial and got me off to the races in terms of teaching myself kind of thing. And I showed him like on a whim, and I was like, oh, here's one of the things I did. And like a week or two later, he texts me and he's like, yo, I keep going back to your blog project and reading it. And when are you going to post more? And when he said that, because, I have an infinite respect for this guy, very smart, I was like, maybe I should pursue this a little bit more seriously, because I was still writing every day. I just didn't update the thing. So I updated it. And then he's like, I think you should like develop this and, see what you can do with it. He's also the one who eventually, after I was, decided to do the podcast and I was rolling with the short stories, the Lucilius parables every Sunday kind of thing. He's the one who's like, you need to get on Twitter. You need to get on Twitter. And I was still like, social media, like, come on, man. Like, don't hold my feet to the fire. Like, I don't want to introduce hell into my mind kind of thing. And he's like, no, like, look at these accounts. And he showed me like Cape Hacks and a few others. He's like, I think the Tinker Thinking material might do well. I was like, okay, you've never led me wrong. I'm just going to like follow your advice because you're probably right. And so I did. And, Tinker Thinking's now has a little bit of an audience. And that's sort of how it developed. So with regards to your original question of like novella versus novel versus short story, it was really a matter of like waking up on Sunday and be like, okay, I need to like bust out a short story like now. And so almost all of the Lucilius parables were written in under 30 minutes. Some of the longer ones, like maybe an hour and a half, like if there's a few 3,000 word parables and it's like, well, it just took that long to like physically write them. But almost all of them are under 30 minutes of just like, I'd sit there thinking about stuff for, 20, 30 minutes. And then the actual execution is like very quick. And I think it's only because of like sort of my previous life as this horribly, tragically serious fiction writer and being somewhat obsessed with language and stories and characters, and just having that sort of practice as a foundation allowed me to be like, oh, I'm just going to bust out these stories now. And with regards to Lucilius sort of like existing in so many different time periods, be it the future, the present, or the past, these are additional freedoms that I gave myself just in terms of like allowing the space for my imagination to, come up with a story once a week. It was like, you know what? He's kind of going to be immortal. I'm going to allow him to be at any age during any time period that suits my curiosity. And I'm just going to run with that. So some people think that Lucilius is immortal and he's like kind of like a vampire. He's just existed forever. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe. It's sort of like a multiverse though. Like, like Rick and Morty. Like I'd written so many Lucilius parables before I discovered Rick and Morty. And then I was like, oh, this is kind of like the family version with profanity and a lot more of like unsavory like subjects mixed in version of Lucilius parables. It's like they kind of exist everywhere and at any time. And it's like, well, that makes sense because from a creative standpoint, it's very freeing.
Absolutely.
But that being said, I do have like a novella for Lucilius with an AI sort of romantic interest. I've got that all outlined and a lot of it written. It's just, it's another project that it's like, oh, I can't wait to like I get to the point where I can just flesh that out completely. I think it'll probably be like an 80,000 word story. But yeah, the whole arc is there. I think it'll be quite nice. And it ties into this whole idea of like multiverse and some of the confusions and like delightful curiosities with regards to time. And it gets a little, out there with regards to like space and black holes. It's fun. I think it'd be fun.
Very cool. And listeners, what he just did was tell you possibly one of the best ways, if you want to get creative about something, he just outlined almost a perfect way to do it. Because what often happens with many of us, I used to write a lot of fictional treatments when I was younger. And I did exactly what you did. I was just like, I'm bored. Well, I had this idea. And so like I've been keeping journals since I was 18 and I have, these are your books I'm holding up, but the journals are over here. And what I found was the minute I tried to like be serious and, I'm going to come up with a serious, impactful story, I got nothing. But then when I just decided, well, I really did enjoy that time where I had the idea about the two people who were being reborn through time, didn't remember their previous lives, but suddenly did, and they were battling each other for supremacy, just so that I would write that out. I would like read it to people and they're like, that's really good. That'd be a good movie, man.
For sure.
Yours are a lot more profound, which is a credit to you, which gets me to kind of my next question. One of the things that I love science fiction, I've read like all of the canon. I don't know if you've read The Fifth Science by Exurbia, but
embarrassingly, I'm actually like very uneducated when it comes to like classic sci-fi. I've read Asimov's Foundation series, and that's pretty much it. Like I've seen some sci-fi movies, but like everyone's always recommending me stuff, and I'm like, oh, gosh, I already have so many books on the go. But like, yeah, I'm actually embarrassingly illiterate when it comes to classic sci-fi.
So you are de novo too. You are a triple threat kind of guy. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was getting ready for our chat was like, so much of what people, myself included, by the way, find like compelling and riveting and whatnot about science fiction is in fact the dark, gritty version of the future. And one of my colleagues and I were speculating about it and like, why? Right. I believe very deeply that human beings are emotionally based creatures and the ruling emotion is fear, specifically fear of the unknown. And which is why if you're going to be a propagandist, fear, uncertainty, doubt never will fail you because you will get them all whipped up in a frenzy because fear.
Classic tools.
Yeah. I mean, they really are. And so on the one hand, maybe what we fear is ourselves. Maybe we fear human nature in kind of the Rene Girard, mimetic idea. He was not a fun guy at a party because he decided at the end, everyone's copying everyone else. Nobody has real desires of their own. Oh, and by the way, the world's going to end in an apocalyptic rage. Bonsoir. Thank you for having me tonight. You can learn a lot by reading Girard, and I'm making light of it. He's actually a really interesting guy you should probably read to understand human OS better. But then there's also the whole Nick Bostrom. I don't know if you know Nick's work, but he's got he was best known for the simulation, which he wrote 20 years ago, by the way. He's got another piece in there that I think is even more interesting, and it's called The Great Filter. The idea is the great filter in front of us or behind us. And as the name implies, the great filter filters everything and leaves it brand spanking new with nobody there.
I think it's best sort of framed in relation to the Fermi paradox. So you look up into the stars and it's like, why don't we see all the blinking lights of different civilizations? Kind of like when you see a city on the horizon kind of thing. It's like the universe or the galaxy seems quite quiet. Like, is it all just stars and quasars and, big clouds of gas out there and asteroids and some rocky planets? Like, where is everyone? And that's the Fermi paradox. And with regards to what you're talking about, the great filter, it's like, well, do all these, maybe there are tons of civilizations, or in the case of the great filter, there were a lot of civilizations and they didn't make it to this great filter. Like, they perish through nuclear war, or, they
nanobots or AI,
or they do gain of research on viruses and then that gets out of the lab and whoops. So or AI just goes ape shit on us in sort of an auto-destructive kind of way, and it's like,
I'm sorry, I can't do that, Dave.
Jim, how? What? That is some sci-fi that I am familiar with.
Yeah. So I tend to be more optimistic about these things. Obviously, AI included. We're going to get to that in a little bit. Then there's the more, this one you might be able to help me with more, because I was always an early adopter of tech. I loved tech. Any new tech I had, if I could afford it. So I bought one of the first CD music changers. I had the first Macintosh. Anything I had the first modems, that, you'd put it on the thing. And I was one of the earliest users of a walled garden, which was called CompuServe, which was the AOL of the late 70s. Literally text, that's all it was. I felt look at me, man. I'm communicating with people in Georgia. Georgia, the state, not the country. But there is this other school of thought, which I am vehemently opposed to, that it fashions that tech itself is evil.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
So I mentioned that I used to be quite a Luddite.
That's why I'm asking specifically.
And, I love saying that sort of in this tongue-in-cheek way. I think the best way of answering this question is to point out the fact that the people who are super anti-tech are still using a lot of tech and depend on it and love it. They just don't realize it's tech. So my personal sort of example of this is I was using a typewriter and I love that typewriter. It had a name. I cared for it. I would love to take it apart and clean it and really care for it. And I love this item. This is a piece of technology. But it didn't really hit me until, as research for one of the stories that I was doing back in the day, pre-Tinkered Thinking days, I went on a tall ship because I was writing fiction that was very much centered around, very regional with regards to New England and around this old sort of sailing culture and the history that sort of current situation propagates from that. And as research, I went on a tall ship as a deckhand, and I was planning to go for 2 weeks. I ended up getting a job. I became the bosun. I stayed for almost a year. I ran a huge maintenance project on that, and I just learned everything on the fly. I rebuilt 40-gallon shrouds, and I put new running backstays on that sucker, and it was the best job of my life. I loved it. And I remember being on deck one day and sailing. We're on the western coast of the United States, and we're headed south, and it's just this beautiful, gorgeous morning, and it's silent. The sails are set, and this 200-ton tall ship is just effortlessly gliding forward. And I'm just sort of marveling at how cool that concept is and that we came up with this. And then I was thinking about container ships, like modern container ships, and how they're just so ugly and clunky, but efficient in a lot of ways that a tall ship just isn't. And it finally sort of hit me, and it bridged. And I was like, because I was thinking about like, wow, why couldn't we keep it this way? Like the golden age of sail, when, you know, the innovations of the Dutch with regards to like stack masts and how you make all of that work. And then, you know, triple masted, quadruple masted ships came about, and just amazing systems that are this elegant dance between, you know, the humans operating it and being up in the rigging and all that stuff. It's just so much more beautiful compared to like the container ship that's just like a rust bucket that floats forward kind of thing with an engine on it. And then I realized like, oh man, this led to that. Like the container ships exist because of this old beautiful thing that I'm sort of in love with at the moment. And it's like, there's actually no difference. One's just better for a whole bunch of reasons. That is the reason that we do it today. And I was like, all the things that I love are actually the reasons why all of the things that I think I hate exist today. So it's one solid sort of like up, you know, as Tony Seba would say, like this set of disruption curves, where like the S curves, where something reaches like full adoption, then it plateaus. It's a compounding of all of these S curves. And even if you look back in terms of the evolution and development of ship design before the engine came about, like the evolution of sail patterns and the way that ships were designed, especially with the innovations that the Dutch did during when, you know, the Dutch was basically an empire. It's basically a whole bunch of S curves in the exact same sort of way that Tony Seba talks about today. It was like, oh, well, you needed electricity, and then you needed the telegraph, and then you needed the CPU, and then you needed a few other like independent technologies that go through their own S curves, and then they all combine and you get an iPhone kind of thing. And so there was like this beautiful and sort of horrific moment when that all came to light in my mind, when I'm looking back and understanding all of this with regards to like the maintenance of a wooden ship today, and how all of that maintenance is really framed in terms of understanding why certain systems in the ship evolved the way they did, given the history of technological development with regards to wood, rope, and sail. And it's like, oh my gosh, it just switched to metal and combustion, and that's what happened. And so it's like, wait a minute, I'm hating the process that gave rise to both. So there's really no difference. And that was really, you know, a big part of like, wait a minute, I think I need to revisit the way that I'm thinking about current technology and the future. It's like all of these things that we get frustrated today. Like, you know, I was watching someone get frustrated with a computer this morning, and for me, it was a little funny, I'm not going to lie. But it's like all of these tiny little frustrations, it's like these are temporary, and this is part of the process. Like technology is like wiggling forward, and part of the reason it can't sprint forward is just because of all of these like little frustrations and inconveniences that we experience as users. It's like, why doesn't this thing work? Like, why do I have to put my password in like a third time, blah blah blah? It's like, it's because the technology is slowly evolving and figuring these things out, kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, it makes total sense. And, you know, like the old quip, we didn't exit the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. We exited the Stone Age because we came up with better fucking ideas.
We invented alloys.
Yeah. And
that's fantastic. I haven't heard that before. I got to use that.
The other thing that I used to I just love to do was, especially young Luddites. Wait, how could you be 24 years old and a Luddite? I just don't understand how that happened. And so I would tease them, and I would say, I hate technology, he texted from a Starbucks using his iPhone.
Yes.
You know,
well,
and
at least I didn't have a phone and I used a typewriter. Like I did try to walk the walk.
You were more real. You were more real. I will give you respect and chops for that.
But I definitely had my hypocrisies for sure.
And so like I can be known to overdo things. And so I had this young guy who was a real Luddite, and like he was spending some time with us. And so like it was winter or late fall. And so we were making a fire, and I pointed at it and I looked at him and I go, that's a technology, you know? And he's like, it is not a technology. And I went, oh, yes, it is. And then, so I take him through, and like literally, if you're familiar with Bob Persig, who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
I love that book.
Me too. It's one of
that book hit me at the exact right time.
Same with me. Same with me. And he's got this wonderful section in there where he talks about, you don't understand. There is no steel in nature, right? It does not exist. It only exists. Everything you see comes out of the minds of human beings. Unless you are looking at a perfectly untouched, untrampled, unvisited piece of earth that no human being has ever been near, you are looking at the results of human imagination. It doesn't exist.
That doesn't exist. We've been everywhere.
We have been everywhere. And like we were chatting earlier, and, you know, it turns out I'm not at all surprised that you too love the book, The Beginning of Infinity. And I think Deutsch makes that case very elegantly from my point of view, because what he does is he takes the time to build the foundation that creates the scaffolding on which you can hang our types of ideas, right? In other words, you did it well with the ship. Your insight of, wait a minute, of course this ship had to be first. It is what led to all of the new innovations. And that, you know, is what Deutsch is arguing for. But I want to return to your stuff, because one of the things that you say is that your intent was to draw analogies to elicit new perspectives. Now I know, because you had so many new perspectives, but that would allow people to expand their mind space a little. I'm putting words in your mouth here. In a new and better direction. Yeah, I 100% agree with that. We're going to talk about your winning essay next. But like, was that something that was like, did that just emerge, or was that like, this is why I want to do this?
Well, I think it ties back into one of your earlier questions about like, why is so much sci-fi so negative, and why is it so dystopian? And this really reminds me of, I don't know if you've read Language and Thought and Action by S.I. Hayakawa.
Sure. Yeah.
So one of the excellent observations that he makes, which may or may not be true, he talks about the sort of death of joy and happiness and all of these positive emotions in relation to poetry. And so if you go back to, you know, if you read Shakespeare's sonnets, like so many of them are like joyous.
Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate.
Exactly. And it's like, do you see poetry like that today? Like, no, not at all. And his sort of theory is that advertising usurped all of the positive emotions in order to sell product.
Right. That's right.
And so I think that if that's correct, and I think there's a really good argument for it, and I really recommend anyone who hasn't read Language and Thought and Action to read that book. It's like 180 pages.
It's not long.
It's fantastic. It's a great primer in terms of just understanding language from like a meta level and informing the way that you communicate in very healthy ways. But back to the point, if he's correct with regards to advertising usurping all of the positive human emotions in order to usurping them in an artistic way to sell products, I think that became a bit of a cultural default, because before like mass advertising, like, you know, like Jules Verne wasn't dystopian sci-fi. It was kind of neutral, positive sci-fi, right?
Right.
And so, you know, of course, there's not perfectly delineated periods in time where things suddenly shift and it's like, all right, all the positive stuff is off limits now. Instead of these shifts through time. And I think maybe advertising in that way, in terms of like, all right, how do we get people to buy something? Well, we got to make them feel good. How do we make them feel good? Well, we remind them of all of the amazing feelings that they can have. It's like, well, how do we do that? It's like, oh, well, we basically write positive poetry. And I now see, I didn't see this before, but like now I see art marketing as this artistic expression or artistic endeavor. And I think it's best sort of looked at it that way in terms of like if you think about an advertisement or just a brand in general, what I was talking about, tinkered thinking as a brand that has an aesthetic and it has a mission and it has, a vibe to it, to use one of the current aspects of parlance. And yes, I think what was his point is what is left over for people who are trying to be like quote unquote authentic artists who are really taking their craft seriously. What's left over in terms of the coterie of human emotions? And it's like, well, there's all the negative stuff, there's all the depressing stuff. And so suddenly what was left for poets and storytellers was to try and connect with people using all of these negative things. So we get dystopia. And so realizing all that, it's like, there's no need for this. Like, there's room for like advertising trying to sell us shit. And there's also room for some positive outlook on the future. And like one of our mutuals, Sam McRoberts, who I talked to quite a bit, author of Screw the Zoo.
I had him on the podcast.
Yeah, I listened to that one yesterday. It was great convo. But like he loves to point out all the time, it's like, change the story, you change the future. If we change the stories that we tell ourselves, then we're going to act differently with regards to what we do today and what we do tomorrow, because we see reality and the possibilities that today and tomorrow present in a different way. So, tinkered thinking has been is a sort of artistic expression of like my switch from, being rather negative about like quite a lot of things to realizing like that was totally unnecessary. And it's a really good example of like, oh, I'm making things way harder for myself than I need to. And so like, all right, is there any way that this can be shared in a way that might be positive? So that's the gist of the mission of tinkered thinking. And so that naturally segued into like, all right, what sort of fiction am I going to write with these Lucilius parables? And the parable itself is also another sort of a get out of jail free card in terms of right. in terms of like freeing up creativity, because it's like, all right, a parable like has a clear moral objective, which is usually looked down upon in terms of like writing serious literature. It's like if you can tell what the author was trying to say too clearly, it's like, oh, that's bad writing. It's like, well, why? Like like, you know what? Like, I don't think I have to agree with that anymore. And if I don't agree with that anymore, that makes writing something every Sunday in like half an hour way easier, because it's like, all right, like I've got a clear like moral objective here. Like I'm not going to sugarcoat it or like try to conceal it in some sort of overly authentic way. It's like I want to be like pretty clear and just straightforward about what I'm doing, but I want to, package it in this nice little story. Like, what's wrong with that?
Yeah. And I mean, so much to unpack there. Have you read the book Unflattening? He uses the Hayakawa. He's a graphic artist. He's a professor at a university. I wish I had his book around here.
Did you
Unflattening.
Interesting. I'm gonna have to look it up.
I'll email it to you after we're done.
Oh, that'd be great.
In fact, I did a thread on it, and I'll send you the thread. It's brilliant.
Fantastic.
Because it's essentially his take on we are escaping words alone, and words alone lead to flatland. And the world is graphic, the world is verbal, the world is all of these things, and that you can combine. Our symbology is getting even more complicated to the point where using a symbol as opposed to like writing out the paragraph that described that symbol is going to work better. And so, but that's his whole book. It's all illustrated. It's really beautiful. And I got it sent to me as a gift. And I'm like, I'm not a graphic novel guy. And so like my youngest daughter was here and she was like, what's this, Dad? And I said, it was a gift. And she goes, you really should give it a try. Because she looks at the back and she goes, now listen, he's an egghead. You'll probably like what he has to say. Just go through it. And I did, and I loved it. And I think listening to you would love it too.
Definitely check it out.
And as far as your thing about marketing, that's brilliant. I'm definitely stealing that. So when you hear me talking about it, You're going to say, hey, wait a minute. I thought that was my idea.
No, I'm all about the free use of ideas. Like,
Yeah.
I'm always coming up with ideas and sharing them. And I have a few people in my life who always say the same thing. They're like you need to protect it, like copyright it. And I was like, you know what? Like, I'm not concerned about that because, like, honestly, if some big organization like stole this idea and it worked, like, that'd be awesome because
Awesome,
like
right?
that would show that I came up with something that's effective. Like, okay, maybe my favorite example of this is I'm also building a meditation app, or I've built a meditation app that's connected to the sort of Tinkered Thinking brand.
Yeah.
And I'm just fine tuning the content, but I had a few beta users, and one of the hallmarks of a meditation app with regards to like forming a new habit, James Clear's Atomic Habits, Charles Duhigg's The Power of Habit, all these books, all of this research around how do you get a good habit. With regards to meditation apps, the ones that are out there, they have this idea of a run streak. And I saw a beta user like get up to like 8 days on their run streak, and then they missed a day and it went to 0, and then they just stopped meditating. And I'm like, okay, there's something here. And I thought about it like obsessively for like 6 days straight. I could not get this out of my mind because I felt like I'd failed that beta user who's a bit of a friend via Twitter and who is like struggling to try and create this meditation practice. And I was like, I've done this. Like, I know I can solve this stupid little problem with regards to how it fits in with human nature, human behavior, and psychology. And it sort of came to me, this idea of a momentum metric. So let's say you do something for 499 days in a row, but you miss the 500th day, your run streak goes to 0. How well does that 0 represent your past behavior?
Not at all.
It doesn't at all. So I came up with this idea of a momentum metric where it's basically a run streak, but if you miss a day, it just subtracts 1 day. If you miss 2 days, it subtracts 2 days. If you miss a week, it goes back to 0. But there's this idea that like you create momentum by doing it every single day. And if you stop, well, you lose a little bit momentum. It's if you're riding a bike and you're traveling at a certain velocity because you've been pedaling, and then you stop pedaling, it's not like you instantly hit a wall and you go to 0, which is what the traditional red streak does. It's like, no, you can glide for a little bit. You'll slow down and you'll eventually stop if you don't pedal anymore, but you don't stop instantly. And so I basically bake that into this new idea of a run streak, which is more of a momentum streak. So I've been beta testing that with people, and it's actually doing quite well. So that's one of the ideas that one of my followers who I talked to about was like, yo, you need to protect this. Like, the other big meditation apps are going to steal this. And I was like, it'd be amazing if they do, because if it helps people create a good habit, like, my work here's done.
We are so simpatico because, in my old life as an asset manager, could not get people to understand that, like, my friend Annie Duke calls it resulting, which is people have this way of thinking that so I decide to invest in company A, right? Mm-hmm. And the investment doesn't work. It goes to 0. Most people think that my decision to invest in company A was a bad decision. Not correct. We don't know whether it was a bad decision or a good decision. The only way we can know that is to use your momentum analysis. I call it base rates. In other words, look at every decision sequentially and see, did this work or did it not work? As you do this, you build up a base rate or a batting average. Not every decision is going to be good. In fact, probably most might be bad. As long as you have some really good ones in there, you're going to be fine. You hobble your own thinking, in my opinion. If you think that looking at a snapshot on your phone for your meditation app and me looking and saying, oh, fuck, I'm at 0 now. Well, fuck that. I'm not going to try that ever again. That isn't the way a human lives their life.
Yeah. And it's demoralizing, and it doesn't create the desire or the emotional incentive to keep at it, which is like,
exactly. It does the opposite.
It's the incentive to not do it. It's like, okay, that I'm shooting myself in the foot in terms of like trying to get people to change their behavior for the better. Like, that needs to change.
Right. Exactly. And so this idea of like, whether a company is a good investing in a company or doing a thing or writing a series, whatever is a good thing or a bad thing, is not something you know ahead of time for the most part. And like we were talking earlier, and like we united very much on our love of making mistakes, because that's how you learn. That's the only way you learn. You can learn from the lives of others. I've read a lot, and I have learned, but for the most part, if you're trying to get good at something, meditation, let's stay with your meditation for a minute, and you make, in quotes, a mistake by missing a day, that should not scuttle your entire program, right?
I mean, people are human. You got to build something that fits well with a human, not some sort of like perfect program. That's
exactly. And that's
a false wish.
And it was funny because as you were talking about the thing that I'm going to steal from you about marketing, glomming all the good human emotions, I was thinking of Edward Bernays, who I've written about a lot, who is a real fucker. He was a nephew. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And he was the guy who essentially rebranded propaganda. He renamed it public relations. I mean, right there alone, what a genius.
Oh yeah, that's amazing.
Genius. But he was not a good guy. And he, for example, some American corporate interests were very put out by the fact that Guatemala would have the temerity to actually elect their own government and expect it to serve their people, than the fruit company, than the United Fruit Company of America.
Yeah.
And so they turned to Bernays to correct the situation. He did so without firing a single bullet. It was all propaganda. And
rebranding.
He rebranded Guatemala.
Guatemala.
But then
oh man,
he also got women to smoke in public. And the way he did it, the cigarette manufacturers came to him, and it used to be taboo in like the teens and 20s for a woman to smoke cigarettes in public, right? And so they knew that good old Eddie, Sigmund's nephew, would have a little ace up his sleeve for that one. And so they went to him and they're like, hey, we want to get women to think that smoking is cool and that they should do it in public. And he's like, say no more. And so he waited for some big thing where he knew there's going to be a lot of press, right? And he had hired a big group of bored debutantes who were quite beautiful. And their mission was quite simple. They were all simultaneously to take out cigarettes and light them at this public event and say, this isn't a cigarette. This is a torch of freedom for women.
Oh my gosh. It's incredible.
And I'm like reading this, and there's actually a good BBC documentary. I'm going to send you quite the email when we're done. I'll include the BBC doc on Bernays, because just like a real, not a good guy, but you got to admit, man, this guy was really clever, because like instantly women smoking in public, like soared.
All right, the way I look at it is like, all right, there's some evil people who are still very effective. And so the way I like to think about it is like, all right, whether they did good things or really bad things is irrelevant compared to like, were they effective and why were they effective? Which are actually neutral questions, because it's like, you can actually learn a lot from your enemy. And if you learn just the right thing from your enemy, well, then you just become more effective.
Yep. Very simple. But the other thing I was thinking about, though, is I've always kind of also had a theory that the poets of today are in fact not poets, they're rappers.
There's a great argument there for sure.
And like, I love music, and I was an early adopter to all kinds. I mean, I was the only white kid in Minnesota with NWA's first issue. And all my friends are like,
oh,
what are you playing, Jim? What is this music? Like, I used to exercise to techno when it was still called European New Beat. And like, my wife would come into the room and she would like listen to, there was this group called Technotronic who I loved. And they were like the beginning of techno here in America.
Mm-hmm.
But techno was huge in Europe at the time, but they called it European New Beat. Again, you got to rebrand, man. Techno, much cooler.
Totally.
Anyway, so I'm listening to it. My wife just comes in And she looks at me, and because it's heavy, you know what techno music is like, trance, and right? I love it. I love it. But,
I'm a big fan.
oh, okay. Well, so am I. So anyway, she comes in and she just looks at me and she goes, sometimes I think to myself, at some point in our marriage, I'm going to have to try to explain him to other people.
Futile.
No way, it can't happen. It will actually when I let loose the AI on my 40 years of scribbling.
Yeah, I've heard you talk. I heard you talk about that in a previous podcast.
I can hardly wait to find out what I'm all about. I don't know. I don't know that I'm going to like it.
I too have like 24, journals that I've been scribbling in for years.
I was actually thinking when I was getting ready for this, I was saying to myself, you know what? I'll bet my bottom dollar that he's going to say, hey, after you use that AI app on your stuff, could you maybe give it to me? And then, but when you think about the whole thing, right? So rappers are the poets. Walt Whitman would have been a killer rapper for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
And Pink Floyd, they would have been the philosophy department at Oxbridge, right? And so it's like people sometimes miss, they categorize. I hate labels because I understand they're necessary, but they withdraw so much information, I think, that it obscures what is meant to be clear, right? Like no exit, that's clear, right? You don't go out that way. But labels that start getting applied to people or philosophies or any of those things, I think are a net negative in society because they lack any nuance because they're a label, right? And they lack any understanding of the ways that, listen, man, listen to Pink Floyd. You don't have to be stoned even. Just listen to Pink Floyd and listen to the lyrics. And you have some remarkable philosophy. Same thing with Doug Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Oh, absolutely.
The minute you understand that Doug Adams is not a comedic science fiction writer, but rather a really deeply profound philosopher, it all makes so much more sense.
He's a philosopher whose medium is humor, which is fantastic.
Exactly. It couldn't be better, really. I mean, honestly, I would read that philosophy all day. It's one of my favorite. I read them all the time. But so there are so many ways to learn things about things that, that aren't labeled. Well, your work, like parables. Okay, well, what's a parable? Well, that isn't exactly what it is. You know what I mean? Your work occupies
it's
kind of a
just
really...
it's just it's the closest sort of word that kind of approximates what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, but that's why I love it. And we're going to dive into the story that you won with, because I think that, it really affected me, honestly, because the payoff, if you will, is that Lucilius decides there's a population brought and kind of a children of men situation. And he decides to get an Optibot, which is an AI-enabled robot. And he gets all obsessed, Lucilius does, that he wonders whether the robot thinks it's a slave. And
David Deutsch read this story and made that exact point. And I was like, Dave, your concerns are absolutely 100% spot on. And were my concerns while I was reading it. And, I reread it, I was like, I don't know if we should judge a story that's been written in like 27 minutes flat, like this harshly. But I also want to give the backstory with regards to like how I thought of this idea or why I thought of this idea. But in terms of like a story, it is not perfect whatsoever. So this whole idea of like an AI willingly or programmatically being a slave is a tough one to parse for sure. And like, did I straddle that tightrope perfectly in this story? Like, no, not at all. No, at least not in my opinion.
I'm actually going to argue with you about that because I think I'm going to argue with you about the meaning of your story.
Fantastic.
That's what I think made this work. It made it work because I'm a huge fan of Viktor Frankl as well. And essentially, the Optibot points out to Lucilius that it is not within his power or his remit to tell the Optibot how to feel. Lucilius has abrogated onto himself something that he does not possess. He does not have the right to tell any other sentient creature, whether it's an AI or a human or whatever, how they must feel. And it reminded me of the Frankl, everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms. And by the way, I would insert sentient being freedoms. And that is to choose one's attitude in any different set of circumstances. And when I got to this part of your story, where the Optibot is essentially channeling Viktor Frankl, I'm like, this is the winner.
Oh,
Because
fantastic.
and the reason I loved it so much is because you bring Deutsch in. So Deutsch is one of the reasons I love him, is because he points out that there is this glitch in human OS, which we are unaware of. And even if we try to remind ourselves continually of, it keeps popping back up into the OS. And that is, we passionately believe that we know what the future holds. We believe that we know that here is our opportunity set, right? This is what we must choose from. And Deutsch demolishes that idea in his book, The Beginning of Infinity. And he's got this great quote, which is something along the lines of, hey, what do you think physicists were thinking about nuclear energy and the internet in 1900?
They weren't.
Nothing, you fucking idiot. They hadn't been invented yet. And this whole idea that we think that we have this skill of prophesizing what innovations are going to come is a huge divot in our ability to open our minds to things like your stories do a great job of getting people to open their minds to. So the reason that I loved this was because of that alone. That sentiment alone just hit me right between the eyes. It's like, he is I never thought of extending it to an AI sentient creature, but it works. It works. You as a human, and by the way, when I say you, I mean me, you, any human, we simply do not possess the right to tell you what your perception of something should be.
I mean, you can try, and in many cases it works, and I think that's what we would rightly call propaganda, or public
Correct.
relations. But just to give a little bit of backstory, if you might like, to this story,
Please.
I got to that point in the story writing it, and the thing that I've come to love most about writing, especially fiction, is that it's like, at least for me at this point, it's a lot like reading. Actually, just reading. So you get to the point like I might have an idea of like where the story's going, or like a kernel that's like, clever that I want to explore. And then I just write it. But like, as I'm writing it, I'm sort of exploring what the story is in the same way that the reader does while they read it. And that's why I say like writing has become way more like reading to me now than it is like stories write themselves, as long as you're actually writing. That's sort of my take on fiction writing. Like, I think it all sums up. Just write, and they'll start writing themselves after a while, and they'll get better, and they'll get better as you go.
My previous guest, that was his message. His message is less thinking, more doing.
Absolutely.
Just start writing.
Absolutely. That's the case with like most things that I find. Like with coding, it's like, all right, I just need to get myself started. And then like 12 hours go by and I've accomplished a bunch, or not, but I've been focused nonetheless the entire, pretty much the entire time. I get hypnotized, which is really enjoyable, to be honest. And it happens with this, this act of fiction writing too. But when I got to this point in the story, I was, it was one of the few times where like I sort of paused and I'm like, all right, how do I explain this? And what came to mind was my own personal experience. Like I was thinking back years ago when I was doing a job that absolutely hated, and I just felt like it was the biggest waste of my time, and it had this tedious component to it, and I was going a little like crazy. But I was also finally figuring out how to install a meditation habit in my life, and I was a number of months in, and I finally had this realization, that sort of mindful moment during the job when I was like, do I have to hate this? It's like, this has been the default for so long. It's like, what if I just kind of reframe this as like a Zen practice, or, imagine myself in some sort of, Zen training, and the task that I'm doing is the Zen master who's like beating me over the head when I make a mistake. And it's infuriating and frustrating. And like, I just want to just, turn around and whack him back kind of thing. But it's like, it's not personified in this case because it's a task that I have to do for a certain amount of time. And it's like, you know what? I think I'm just going to relax and enjoy the moment, because it's possible to enjoy the moment kind of regardless of what's going on. And I feel like that's a big secret that many people never figure out, but a lot of people today just haven't figured out. It's just like so easy to get riled up and like quote unquote triggered. Like my favorite hated word, to be honest.
Mine too. Too.
And so I got to that point in the story. I was like, wait a minute. Like, I've been here before. I've been exactly where this like AI Optibot is. What was my solution for it that became incredibly effective? Like, how did I turn this thing that I hated into this really beneficial sort of meditation practice? And I was like, all right, well, that's what the bot gets, and it ties back into Viktor Frankl, back to the Stoics, Seneca writing to Lucilius, it all comes full circle.
Totally. And I, again, could not agree with you. I mean, like the problem with these kinds of insights I have found, because I work with a lot of younger people, not just in finance, in a variety of industries, for whatever reason, they think that it might be valuable to hear what I think about things. Big mistake number one. But anyway, it's like what you just said, the ability to choose your disposition, right? It's something that I too learned in a bit of a satori when I was younger. Like I was in my 20s and I was doing something that I fucking hated. And it was like, I was just pissed off at the world. And it was like, I didn't want to do it. I was ordered to do it. I hate authority. And like, everything about it was bad. Like it incorporated everything I disliked, like physical labor, being told to do something, like rote without any kind of creativity. And I was in a foul mood. And I was just like internally just swearing. And at the same time, so I must have been 23 or 24, I was reading the ideas of the Banner and those guys, the neuro-linguistic programmers, about deep language and how literally changing the way you put something will literally change you physically. And I remember thinking about that and thinking that wouldn't work here. And I'm just like, what have I got? And it was one of those, I stopped doing what I was doing with my little bag, picking up the shit that my father had told me I had to in this big yard. And I just thought to myself, is it going to get any worse? Are you going to get any more pissy or more angry? Probably not. You probably maxed out on your bile. And so in that instant, I just like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to look at all this stuff. It was after a big party. I won't go into the various elements that I was picking up, but they were big party, garbage. Right. And like what I decided to do was pick up a cigarette pack. But here was what my decision was. I am going to look at this thing like I'd never seen it before.
Fascination.
And I was transformed. I mean, literally, the rest of the time doing this task was truly a joy, because I was like, oh, that's why they do this with the lighter over. I missed that. I would have never figured out that was a safety feature, right? And like, ever since then, it was just kind of like one of those things that I get to decide. Right. And, that led me, I was always a big into Taoism, but then the Stoics pop up and I'm like, Well, of course, all these brilliant people from 4,000 years ago have already written all about this.
Yeah, they've
And
already figured it out.
they figured it out, right? But the thing is, and that's the challenge, I so far have failed in either through language, analogy, or metaphor to be able to get people to truly experience. They can intellectually understand. Oh, yeah, that sounds interesting, right? So, okay, Jim, you're looking at a broken pair of glasses and being fascinated by them. Not my style, dude, you know? And do you find that? I mean, when people talk to you about your stories, do you ever find yourself just listening and going, man, it's like the Woody Allen thing where he brings Marshall McLuhan out with the guy in line, and Woody Allen is listening to this guy, and he can't take it another minute because he's butchering McLuhan's all of his ideas. And so Woody goes and gets Marshall McLuhan, brings him into the scene. Marshall McLuhan looks at the guy and goes, "You have absolutely no idea of what I'm trying to say." Do you ever find yourself like in one of those conversations, and then what do you do?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I think I tried to apply what you just said, where it's like I kind of get curious about why the person has this interpretation or thinks in this sort of way. So I get curious about the actual person as opposed to like their misrepresentation of it. And
That's smart.
I start getting like interested in who they are, and that gives me a clue into why they are, and then why they're thinking the way they're thinking, that sort of thing. So I kind of just try to dive in a little deeper. But while you're talking to me, something from Robert Pirsig popped into my head, and a rephrasing popped into my head that I think you might really appreciate. At one point in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, he says, the only Zen at the top of a mountain is the Zen you bring there, right?
Yeah.
In the context of, you know, the story and like reframing things that you don't like, I was thinking about it, and it's like you can learn a lot in hell if you figure out how to bring a little bit of heaven with you. And it's
Wow,
like
I love that.
like
That's quite true.
the tedious, like abhorrent activity, you know, that the Optibot is presumably going to be doing, like washing dishes for you know, decades or whatever, can be really enjoyable and quite meditative if you figure out how to like bring that piece of heaven with you into this hell. And that piece of heaven is your perspective, but you know, one that you can control, where it's like, I'm going to enjoy this. I'm going to immerse myself into it. I'm going to get really curious about what the hell is going on as I'm experiencing it. And, you know, that's a big thing that I've written so much about with regards on the Tinkered Thinking platform. It's like curiosity like solves for so many variables. Like if you're curious enough, like literally very little else matters. Like if you're curious, like really curious, confidence is irrelevant, because your imagination and your creativity, as they are hooked up to curiosity, which is like imagination and creativity and like forward motion into unknown territory, your curiosity solves for like any sort of insecurity or lack of confidence, because you're too busy exploring something to have the wherewithal to be self-conscious. You know, you stop thinking about like the I and like, oh, who am I? And like, how is like what I'm doing, like reflecting on my reputation and like my name, and my name is a name brand. Like all of that washes away because it's like, you're way too focused on what you're doing, you know? And
Totally agree. And like, that is, I have tried to, your way of doing, I love I'm going to steal that too. You can learn a lot. You can learn a lot in hell if you bring a little heaven with you. Ultimately, if you are curious, like curiosity is a real shit starter, not an original quote with me. I love the quote though. But you are so right. Like when I was talking to David Senra, the guy, the Founders Podcast guy, like afterwards, you and I had about an hour conversation before recording. He and I had like a 2-hour conversation before recording.
oh man, that's amazing. I'm not surprised.
We are completely aligned on, listen, the dirty little secret here is if you are voraciously curious, nothing else matters, because like, that's it. That solves for so many things.
Yeah. It solves for focus. Like that's probably the biggest one. Like all these productivity, like hackers and writers,
Horrible.
like trying to come up like, oh, the Pomodoro method, like, oh, just do it for 32 minutes and then take a tomato break or whatever, like for 4.5 minutes. It's like, what are you doing? Like, you're clearly not interested enough if you gotta like slice up yourself into like these nice little Tupperware containers of your day. Like just this can be a bit of a problem. Like I'll get into like the flow of like working on coding or writing or whatever, especially with coding, because like problems can take so much time. And I'm just like hypnotized. I'm like, as they say, in the flow, which is also
Right.
a bit annoying after a while. But then it's like, why is it light? And I look over, it's like, the sun is up again. I've stayed up all night again. Like I just went my sleep schedule, but then I look back at the screen. I was like, oh, well, I actually did get a lot done. So I guess it's worth it.
It's so true. Prescriptions in general. Everybody wants, here's the 10 things that I wrote. Like when I do threads, I usually write them right on the app, right on Twitter. I do everything wrong on Twitter. It's like I write the thread while I'm thinking about it. Everyone keeps talking about your draft tweets folder. And I had no idea what the fuck that even was until a younger friend took pity on me and he goes, here's, just go up into the unsent tweets. And I'm like, okay. So I click on it. It's empty. And I take a picture of it. And he goes, you are such a madman. But see, the thing is that everybody wants to be told, it's like the Banksy quote, well, I never took initiative because no one told me to.
I didn't know that one. That's good.
But it's true. I mean, all these people, it's like prescriptions where, it's like I'm reliving me getting triggered and I'm triggered by the word triggered. So then I get really triggered. But like by these clickbait farms, 10 things that all millionaires do before 9 a.m. in the morning. Oh, fuck you, man. I mean, come on. Like, no, they don't. No, they don't. And if they did, everybody would be doing those 10 things if they wanted to be a millionaire. Clearly, that is false. This is false, sir.
I think it goes back to your little diatribe against categorization and labels. Like, if you can fit success into like 10 quaint points, then that's just super satisfying for like the mind, because it's like, no brain power required, no nuance required. Someone's already like filtered out the nuance. Everything is like simple and black and white, and this one only has 8 points. That's even better. Less reading. I'll get more done today. Like, he's like, what is going on? It's like, that's absolute nonsense. Threads with bullet points on Twitter, like, oh my god. Like some of them, like when they got a quote attached to each one of them, it's like, all right, this is like titillating the spirit a little bit, but like, yeah. Your whole point about like 10 things millionaires do is like, oh my god, okay.
Oh, it's just like now
is a millionaire tweeting this?
No.
What? What are you talking about?
There's a great meme that I love GIFs and I love memes, but I only do them as found art. So in other words, I don't make them, I find them. And like, there's this one, that's a dialogue between two people who are both off cartoon stage, right? This guy is over here and this guy's over here. You don't see any people, but you see their little dialogue bubble. And the one guy is saying, hey, my buddy who just wrote that book about how to get rich needs money. And then the other guy is, tell him to read his book.
That's like money Twitter right there, and the whole sort of like mimetic Ponzi scheme.
Oh
like,
my God. I mean, it's like almost unbearable. And it's like a guilty pleasure for me to just go dip in. And I know it's like,
don't fake it till you make it. Just get more curious about shit. You'll be fine.
You'll be fine. That is absolutely the honest answer. The honest answer is there is no path that leads to 100% success. It does not exist, right? Yours. Just get curious. don't fake it till you make it. Well, that's just silly. Why would you do that? Why, why would you try to pretend to be somebody else? Everyone else is taken, as Oscar Wilde said. Be yourself, right?
Excellent.
Like,
Totally.
all of these, now there are always exceptions, right? Like, I think Clear's book is pretty good, Atomic Habits. I had him on, and it's actionable. He's just he's building. I wrote a thread on how to do habits, right?
Absolutely.
I haven't looked at it, and so I got out of the habit of writing those things.
I studied his book quite a bit, especially in preparation for trying to build this meditation app. But please continue.
Yeah, no. So, but the dirty little secret here is there is no dirty little secret. Dirty little secret is curiosity is kind of like the cure-all, if you will, for anything. Now, here's the big question. I have an idea about this, but how do you make people more curious?
Oh, well, this segues into one of my favorite topics, which is the question as a concept. So if you're not curious enough, you haven't asked yourself the best question, or you haven't asked yourself even a good question about what's
Your
going.
questions have been shit. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And if I had I often ask people, have you asked yourself the best possible question with regards to the topic at hand? Especially if someone's dealing with some sort of conundrum or problem, instead of trying to hand them a solution, I'm really trying to ask a question that helps them sort of open up their thinking to try and so they can think differently about their situation.
Yeah.
And so the question as a concept, there's really two types of questions. There's one where the answer is known. And that's not a genuine question in my eyes. It's more of a request for information.
Right.
If you ask a spouse, it's hey, did you take out the trash this morning? That's a definitive question that presupposes or even knows that there is a knowable answer. By default, someone knows the answer to this question. So it's not really a question, it's a request for information. A genuine question is one that no one knows the answer to yet. So a good example is hey, here's this business idea. Will it make money? It's people can have opinions on that, but there's only one real way to know. And that's well, just execute on it and find out for yourself. I mean, unless it's identical to some other business model, then you can get really pedantic. It's well, this one did, and it's the exact same. It's well, then is that a genuine question? Maybe not. And so then the way that I look at this is all right, a genuine question is really, it doesn't have an answer yet, like I said before. So it's this exploration of the unknown. And this is why so many people procrastinate by just ruminating on genuine questions. What's the meaning of life? It's well, there's no definite answer. Maybe you can make it up, but it's just fun fodder to talk about unless you're taking action to figure out the answer to this question yourself. And so you really have to go on a journey to find out the answer to a genuine question. Will this business model make sense? It's well, you got to bring it to life and find out yourself. You got to go on that journey. Or if you take the word question and you lop off the last three letters, what do you get? You get quest. You have to go on a quest to find the answer to this question.
And that's like your story, The Destination, right? Where
exactly.
Where he decides at the end of his journey that he has to find a destination.
Yeah. I didn't think about it. That story actually relates quite well to this. And so then a request is just oh, can you replay the quest that someone's already gone on?
Exactly.
So that I can teleport to the answer by you just giving me the end of the story kind of thing.
And by the way, that is how we get the world we got today, right? Cumulative cultural evolution is just lots of requests going in. Hey, what's this rubbing the two sticks together? That makes a spark, and then I can cook my food and my brain is going to grow twice the normal size. But it accumulates, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then, as Robert Anton Wilson called it, along comes Gutenberg, and suddenly we can time bind our ideas. Prior to that, we couldn't time bind our ideas. We could, but
it was tedious.
It was very tedious. I don't know about you.
It wasn't efficient and it couldn't scale. I think that's
Yeah, exactly. And probably both of us would probably be hard pressed to find a happy place doing our scribing. Well, I'm looking at the clock and I can't even believe, talk about being in a flow.
Oh yeah. We've been
Th-
chatting
th-
for a while.
This has been awesome. I didn't even get to like half the stuff I wanted to, which means that you get a return request because there is some, I love your ideas of digital plunge, for example, where the video game is of future scenarios where they're really trying to solve for existential risk.
That's the thing. So I like forget about like a lot of these stories. I'm like, oh my gosh, which one is that?
But that's a brilliant idea. And now that I'm involved in AI, like I am, AI can be helpful there. And so I want to talk about that. I think it's a great idea. I think it'd be a great game. I think it'd be a great game.
I mean, in some ways, it kind of is every game or every RPG that you can sort of like respawn. Yeah,
exactly. But like, what a great thing to, oh yeah, by the way, at the end of it, there's these 3 existential things over here. You really don't want those things to happen. Okay. And by the way, try knocking me off the top, sucker.
Find any path that avoids the end.
Yeah. Let's avoid that. And then you also have this other thing that you don't come right out and say it unless I missed a place where you did. But the idea of virtual worlds as training models, like that story, The Egg, that's popular online. I don't know whether you've ever seen that.
Yeah, that's a great one.
I love it. It's a recurrent theme in your work as well.
I love playing around with recursion. I find it so much, and it relates really well with like what you're talking about here.
Same. I mean, totally same with me. Well, listen, this has been beyond fun for me. At the end of each one of these, you're coming back, so you're going to have to actually think of 4. But I'll give you time to think about it, except for this one. So we're making you the emperor of the world. We're giving you a magic microphone. You can't kill anyone. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp. You can't make certain that old girlfriend or significant other is humiliated in front of the world's population. However, I am giving you a magic microphone that you get to speak in, and you get to say 2 things. And the next morning, for whenever morning is for the other nearly 7.5 billion humans, or what are we at, 8 billion now? I think 7.5.
Yeah, I think we just passed the line. I think we're at 8 billion now.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So give or take 500 million, they're going to all wake up, and those 2 things that you spoke into the mic, they're going to think they thought of. And when they wake up, not only are they going to think they thought of them, they think this is the best idea I've ever had. I'm going to go do that all the time now.
Oh gosh. Yeah. No pressure, huh? I think I would go back to that point on curiosity earlier. If you have enough curiosity, confidence is irrelevant. And if you if you don't have enough curiosity, then you haven't asked yourself the best question yet. I think that would be one, like tying curiosity as like this sort of master variable with like questions and how they sort of, one is the tool for the superpower of the other. Other than that, I think I'd take a dig at hope. I'd say hope grows foolish with no doing. Like if you don't,
I love that.
Yeah, if you don't take action based on what you hope the future to be, like you're just Russian roulette with disappointment right there.
Totally agree.
Like people talk about like manifesting stuff, and I just want to like bitch slap them. Like, what are you talking about? Like, go do something. Like, you want $1 million to land on in your lap. Like, go work hard, and maybe it'll happen.
We seem to have the same triggers because, like, listen. By the way, there is a kernel of truth in the idea of manifesting. That kernel of truth, which they piled all of this bullshit on top and sold 10 million copies of a book called The Secret that I could not bring myself to buy simply because I do have standards. And anyway, I found like what they were saying in it by my sleuthing online. And like the kernel at the center of it is do become what we continually think and do.
Oh.
That's the part you've got to emphasize.
100%. Like that's why
And
hope grows foolish with no doing.
no doing. Exactly.
And so this ties, I mean, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but this ties up in my one of my favorite books, which is The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James.
Oh, that's a great book. Yeah. I
Well,
haven't read that one in a long time.
the end of it really absolutely nails this whole wishy-washy area of like manifesting versus and or affirmations, and this, you know, how prayer is kind of regarded separately. He basically goes on this wonderful analysis of like case studies and religious literature and stuff. And at the very end, if you might remember, he basically says prayer does work, but only if you pray about the right things. And the right things are things that you can control. If you pray for better outcomes with regards to things that you actually can take action on, then the prayer basically changes the way that you behave on a daily basis. And the change in your daily behavior compounds into like results that are the things that you're praying for. So like as long as like you're, you know, manifesting or affirmations or prayer is all focused on things that you actually have some practical influence over based on what you actually do, what your daily behavior really is, then it will work. But that's why hope grows foolish with no doing. If you hope for things that you don't take any action on, or that you don't have any influence on, like you're going to be a fool, because you're going to end up disappointed.
I got to tell you, man, like the other thing that I love is that you have managed to condense these into wonderful and memorable phrases that hopefully our listeners will, when they walk away from listening to this or reading it or whatever they do, that stays, it becomes a mind worm, right?
Thank you.
Because like, it's like, I used to always say, look, knowledge or action without knowledge is foolish, right? But knowledge without action is futile.
Nice.
Like
I'm going to write that one down.
what are you going to accomplish, man? You're going to accomplish nothing. You're just going to sit there and like, I don't know, maybe if you're the Buddha, that's cool. I'm not the Buddha, and I'm never going to be the Buddha. You know, I love all of the awakening. I love Tony DeMello and Jed McKinnon and all those guys. But like, if you read them too, they're all about action. Well, come on. He just, for those who will not be able to see my kind guest here, just held up Jed McKinnon's book. He knows I'm a sucker. Or if it involves David Deutsch with Jed McKenna, you got me.
Well, I picked it up because you and Sam McRoberts are always talking about it on Twitter. I was like, all right, finally, I'm going to read this book. So I've really been enjoying it with it. This first one, I'm almost done with it.
There is the second one, given your nautical interests, you might really be interested in the second one, which is all about Melville and Moby Dick.
Oh, fantastic. One of my favorite books.
I think when you read his interpretation of it, you're going to love it.
Oh, fantastic.
Because it's so unique and it's so not the normal interpretation of Moby Dick. I think stick with it, my friend. You will be happy.
It's next.
Be happy.
It's next on the roster, so I'll definitely give it a go.
All right. Well, this has been absolutely delightful. I will have you back on. Great to know you.
Likewise. Thank you.
See you. Bye.
Cheers.